My name is Eleanor, and I am 42 years old. My husband told me he loved me for the first time on our wedding day. 20 years later, I found out the only reason he married me was to destroy my father. Before we dive into the secret I've carried for all these years, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment below guessing what the final twist will be. Now, where were we? It's funny how a life can be built on a single sentence. For 2 decades, mine was built on David's words, whispered against my ear as we slow danced in a room full of flowers and hope. I love you, Eleanor. Finally, that word, finally, felt like the closing of a circle, the end of a long and patient wait. I saw him as my reward for a quiet, often lonely childhood. I was the only daughter of Thomas Croft, a man who was more of a monument than a father. He was a titan of industry, his name etched onto skyscrapers and whispered in boardrooms. He loved me, I suppose, in the way a king loves his heir, as an extension of his own legacy. But David saw me. He was kind, gentle, and utterly unimpressed by the Croft name. He was an architect, a man who built things with his hands, a stark contrast to my father who moved markets with a phone call. Our life was a portrait of quiet, domestic bliss. A sprawling house in the suburbs, 2 bright, wonderful children, and a love that felt as solid and dependable as the ground beneath our feet. My father passed away 3 years ago, and David was my rock. He held me as I wept, he managed the estate. He seamlessly stepped into the role of patriarch, both for our family and for my father's company, Croft Enterprises, where he had taken an executive role years prior at my father's insistence. He was perfect. Too perfect. The first crack in this perfect facade was almost invisible. It was a Tuesday night, and I was looking for a misplaced property deed in David's private study, the one room in the house that was implicitly off-limits. He'd always said it was a sanctuary, where he kept his architectural drafts and the chaos of his creative mind. I never questioned it. But that night, with him out at a late meeting, I felt a pull. The room was meticulously organized, unlike the creative mess he described. And on his desk, I saw a framed photo turned face down. I'd never seen it before. My hand trembled as I turned it over. It was a faded picture of a smiling family, a man, a woman, and a young boy of about 10. The boy's smile was familiar. It was David's smile. But the man and woman were strangers. A cold knot formed in my stomach. David had always told me his parents died in a car crash when he was a teenager. He had no other family. It was a tragic story I never dreamed of questioning. Why would I? But as I stared at this picture, I felt a deep, chilling sense of wrongness. My perfect husband, the man whose history I thought I knew intimately, was a stranger. Driven by a frantic need I didn't understand, I decided to tackle the one place I'd been avoiding for 3 years, my father's home office. It had been left exactly as it was the day he died, a shrine to a man I was never sure I truly knew. I told myself I was looking for old family photos, anything to explain the picture on David's desk. As I sorted through filing cabinets filled with soulless corporate reports, my fingers brushed against a false bottom in a deep drawer. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal and a thick manila envelope. My father wasn't a man for diaries. My heart hammered against my ribs. The envelope contained yellowed newspaper clippings and legal documents from 25 years ago. The headlines screamed about a hostile takeover. My father, in his prime, had acquired and dismantled a smaller, family-run competitor, the Vance Corporation. The articles were brutal. They painted my father as a predator. The owner, Robert Vance, had lost everything. His family was ruined. The final clipping was a short, stark obituary. Robert Vance, dead of a massive heart attack just weeks after the collapse of his company. His wife and young son survived him. My blood ran cold. I opened the journal. My father's neat, clinical script filled the pages. He wasn't journaling his feelings. He was documenting a war. And then I saw the name. David Vance. My father had written, Robert's son is a ghost. Disappeared after the funeral. The boy would be about 17 now. A loose end. I dropped the journal. I felt the air leave my lungs. David Vance. The smiling boy in the photograph. The man sleeping in my bed. The father of my children. His entire life, his entire identity was a lie. He hadn't stumbled into my life by chance. He had targeted me. He had spent 20 years wrapped in the skin of a perfect husband, waiting. For what? For this. To be at the heart of my father's empire, trusted, powerful, and in perfect position to burn it all to the ground. The grief was immediate and suffocating, not just for my marriage, but for the woman I had been, the naive, trusting woman who had built her life on a foundation of lies. But beneath the grief, a cold, hard anger began to form. I was my father's daughter, after all. I decided I would confront him. I would lay the evidence on the table and watch his mask crumble. But before I could, something stopped me. It was the night of the annual Croft Enterprises Gala. David was on stage, accepting an award on my father's behalf. He spoke of my father's brilliance, his vision, his legacy. And as he spoke, he looked at me, his eyes full of what I had always believed was love. But now I saw it for what it was, the cold, patient triumph of a predator. Later that night, I found him in his study on the phone, his back to the door. His voice was low, devoid of the warmth he always used with me. "It's all in place," he said. "The transfer will be finalized at the board meeting on Friday. By the time they realize what's happened, Croft Enterprises will be an empty shell. The old man's legacy will be ash. A perfect anniversary gift for my father. Friday, the anniversary of Robert Vance's death. This wasn't just about exposure. This was about annihilation. He was going to bankrupt the company, destroy my family's name, and leave us with nothing, all while playing the part of the grieving son-in-law trying to save a sinking ship. He had played me, my father, the board, everyone. The sheer scale of his deception was breathtaking. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I was about to run, to scream, to expose him, when my eyes fell upon my father's old desk set, which I'd brought home from his office. A heavy, ornate fountain pen lay in its holder. On a whim, I picked it up. It felt off balance. I twisted the base, and a tiny USB port was revealed. My father, the man of secrets and contingencies, had been watching. I plugged the pen into my laptop. There were dozens of audio files, recorded over years. Most were just muffled meeting notes. But the last one was different. It was dated a week before my father's final heart attack. It wasn't a recording of a meeting. It was a message. For me. "Eleanor," his voice crackled, weak but clear. "If you are hearing this, it means I failed. It means he is closer than I thought. David Vance. I've known for years who he is. I couldn't prove it. The boy is clever, patient. He wants to tear down what I built. But he doesn't understand. The company, it's a fortress. He thinks he's at the gates, but he doesn't know about the inner walls. I was a bastard in my day, Eleanor. I did things that created men like him. This is the blowback. Don't mourn the company. It's just a name. The real legacy, the real wealth, it's protected. In your name. The codes are in the one place he would never look, the place he thinks represents your weakness. Your mother's music box. A plot twist inside a plot twist. My father hadn't been a blind victim. He'd been a player in a game that was still going on. He hadn't left me a ruin, he had left me a weapon. And in that moment, my plan for revenge changed. It would not be loud and messy. It would be quiet, elegant, and absolute. Friday arrived. The boardroom was a chamber of tension. The board members, loyal to David, looked at me with pity. The grieving daughter, about to lose her father's legacy. David stood at the head of the table, a portrait of somber leadership. He laid out his proposal, a strategic dissolution, to pay off mounting, fabricated debts. It was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage. He slid the final papers to the center of the table, looking at me. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor," he said, his voice a perfect symphony of regret. I let the silence hang in the air. Then I smiled. "That won't be necessary, David," I said, my voice clear and steady. I stood and walked to the front of the room. "There seems to be a misunderstanding about the company's financial health. I didn't expose his identity. I didn't mention his father. That was a private hell he could live in. Instead, I announced the activation of the Croft Legacy Protocol. Using the codes from my mother's music box, I unlocked the true fortune my father had squirreled away for decades in protected offshore accounts, a fortune that dwarfed the company's public valuation. As of this morning," I continued, The entirety of the Croft family's liquid assets have been transferred into a new charitable foundation. The Croft Redemption Foundation. A wave of murmurs swept the room. David's face was a mask of disbelief. This foundation, I said, my eyes locked on his, will be dedicated to one mission, providing financial and structural support to families and small businesses that have been destroyed by hostile corporate takeovers. The color drained from David's face. He understood. In fact, I said, placing a single file on the table in front of him, our first grant will be a full and complete restitution, with interest, to all the families affected by Croft Enterprises acquisitions in the 1990s. We will start with the Vance family. I had not destroyed him. I had erased him. His 2 decades of patient, meticulous revenge had just become the funding source for his own compensation. He was no longer an avenger. He was a charity case. His life's work wasn't to destroy my father's legacy, but to enable its redemption. He was left with a choice: accept the money, a public admission of his own failure, or refuse it and be left with absolutely nothing. He just stared at me, his mask finally shattered, revealing the hollow, broken man underneath. I didn't save my father's company. I buried it, but on my own terms, turning a monument to greed into a legacy of atonement. I didn't forgive my father for the man he was, but I finally understood him. And in doing so, I freed myself from the weight of his sins and the poison of my husband's hatred. Justice, I learned, isn't always about watching things burn. Sometimes, it's about controlling the ashes. But the story doesn't end there, because revenge, I discovered, has a way of echoing through generations in ways you never anticipate, and what I thought was the final chapter turned out to be merely the intermission in a play that had been running since before I was born. The morning after the boardroom confrontation, I woke up alone in the bed I'd shared with David for 20 years, and the emptiness felt different this time, not lonely but liberated, like I'd finally reclaimed space that had never truly been mine. He hadn't come home that night, and I hadn't expected him to, because what do you say to someone after they've systematically dismantled your entire existence, and you've responded by turning their life's mission into a charitable tax write-off? There are no greeting cards for that particular situation. No established protocol for the morning after you discover your marriage was a multi-decade con, and you just publicly neutered your husband's revenge plot in front of the city's business elite. I made coffee in the kitchen where David had kissed me good morning thousands of times, each kiss now revealed as a small, patient lie, and I thought about the architecture of deception, about how a man could build an entire false identity the way he built buildings, with blueprints and foundations and careful attention to load-bearing walls. He told me once, early in our relationship, that the key to good architecture was making the structural support invisible, making people feel safe without knowing why, and I realized now he'd been describing his own methodology, his own blueprint for infiltrating my life. Every moment of tenderness had been a carefully placed beam, every shared laugh a hidden support column, all of it designed to hold up the illusion long enough for him to position himself at the heart of my father's empire and detonate it from within. My children, Alex and Sophie, both away at college, had no idea yet what had transpired. They knew their grandfather as a distant, demanding figure who died before they could really know him, and they knew their father as the warm, engaged parent who coached soccer and helped with homework and never missed a school play. How do you tell your children that half their genetic inheritance is a lie, that their father isn't the man they think he is, that he married their mother not out of love but out of a desire to destroy a dead man's legacy? I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand, their contact information glowing on the screen, and I couldn't make myself dial, couldn't make myself be the one to shatter their understanding of their own history. Instead, I called my lawyer, Marcus Chen, a man who'd served my father for 30 years and who'd looked at me with genuine pride in that boardroom when I'd activated the Croft Legacy Protocol. He arrived within an hour, his BMW pulling into the driveway with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything about Marcus. And we sat in my father's study, the same study where I'd found the photograph that started unraveling everything, and we talked about the practical realities of dismantling a 20-year marriage built on fraud. Marcus explained that legally, I had grounds for annulment based on fraud and misrepresentation of identity, that David's entire marriage to me could be erased as if it had never happened, but then he paused and looked at me with something like sympathy and said, "But Eleanor, that would make your children illegitimate in the eyes of the law, and is that really what you want? To erase them too? I hadn't thought of that. Hadn't considered that annulling my marriage would retroactively bastardize my children, would turn them into legal footnotes in a revenge plot they'd never asked to be part of. Marcus said we could pursue a traditional divorce instead, citing irreconcilable differences, or even fraud if I wanted, but he warned me that David could fight it, could drag it out, could make it ugly in ways that would hurt the children more than anyone else. He asked me what I wanted, what outcome would let me sleep at night, and I realized I didn't know, didn't have a clear vision beyond the boardroom moment, hadn't thought past the satisfaction of watching David's face crumble as I turned his revenge into my redemption. What I wanted, I told Marcus, was for David to disappear, to simply vanish from my life and my children's lives as completely as he'd vanished from his own identity 23 years ago when he'd stopped being David Vance and started being David Mitchell, my perfect architect husband. Marcus said that kind of disappearing act required cooperation, required David to want to go quietly, and given what I'd just done to him in that boardroom, cooperation seemed unlikely. But then Marcus smiled, that particular smile that reminded me he'd learned his craft from my father, and he said unless we give him a reason to cooperate, unless we make staying more painful than leaving. Over the next 3 days, Marcus orchestrated what he called a strategic pressure campaign, reaching out to David through intermediaries with a simple message. Accept the quiet divorce with a minimal settlement and a non-disclosure agreement, or face a very public revelation of his true identity and his decades-long fraud. We had all the evidence, Marcus explained to David's lawyer. We had the photograph and the journal and my father's recording, and we were prepared to release all of it to the media along with a detailed timeline of David's infiltration of the Croft family. The story would be irresistible to journalists, Marcus said, the perfect storm of corporate intrigue and personal betrayal, and David's reputation, his career, his entire constructed identity would be destroyed not by corporate maneuvering but by tabloid exposure. David's response came through his lawyer on day 4, a single word: agreed. He would accept the divorce terms, would sign the non-disclosure agreement, would walk away from the marriage with only his personal possessions and a modest settlement that wouldn't even cover a year's worth of his current lifestyle. In exchange, his identity would remain protected. The children would be told their father was having a midlife crisis and needed space, and the official story would be irreconcilable differences with no fault assigned. It was, Marcus said with satisfaction, the best possible outcome, a clean break that protected everyone except the man who'd started this whole mess. But I couldn't let it end there, couldn't let David simply walk away without understanding the full scope of what he'd lost and why. I asked Marcus to arrange one final meeting, just me and David. No lawyers, no witnesses, just the two of us in the same room one last time. Marcus advised against it, said there was nothing to be gained from direct confrontation, but I insisted. And because Marcus had known me since I was a child, he understood that some things can't be resolved through legal documents and strategic pressure. Some things require you to look someone in the eye and speak your truth. We met in a neutral location, a private room in a downtown hotel, the kind of anonymous corporate space that could have been anywhere in America, all beige walls and generic landscape paintings and furniture designed to be inoffensive. David arrived first, and when I walked in, I barely recognized him. In less than a week, he'd aged years, his face gaunt and gray, his eyes hollow with something that looked like grief but might have been just exhaustion. He didn't stand when I entered, didn't offer any of the small courtesies that had defined our 2 decades together, just watched me cross the room and sit in the chair opposite him with an expression I couldn't read. I prepared a speech, had practiced it in the mirror that morning, but sitting across from this man who I'd loved and who'd never loved me back, all my prepared words felt inadequate, too small for the magnitude of what we'd done to each other. So instead, I asked him a simple question: why me? Why not just destroy my father's company from a distance? Why marry me? Why spend 20 years building a life with me? Why give me children? Why make it all so personal? David was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, stripped of the warm, gentle tone I'd known, replaced by something flat and tired. He said that when he was 17, and his father had died from the heart attack brought on by my father's hostile takeover, he wanted to die too, had stood at the edge of his father's grave, and wished he could climb in and disappear. His mother had fallen apart, had never recovered from the loss, had spent her remaining years in a psychiatric facility, leaving David truly alone in the world. He'd spent those first few years after his father's death consumed by rage, plotting elaborate revenges that ranged from the practical to the absurd, and he changed his name and created a new identity because David Vance was a victim, and he couldn't bear being a victim anymore. He said he'd researched my father obsessively, had learned everything about Croft Enterprises and the Croft family, and he discovered that Thomas Croft had one weakness, one soft spot in his armor of corporate ruthlessness, me. His only daughter, his heir, the one person he seemed to genuinely care about beyond her utility to his empire. And David had realized that the perfect revenge wasn't to destroy the company, because my father had destroyed dozens of companies, and it had never touched him personally, had never made him feel the loss that Robert Vance's family had felt. The perfect revenge was to take what my father loved, to infiltrate his family, to become indispensable, and then to rip it all away when it would hurt the most. So David had engineered our meeting, had positioned himself at an architectural conference my father was speaking at, had made himself interesting and talented and humble enough to catch my father's attention. He'd courted me with patience and genuine effort because he knew my father was watching, knew that Thomas Croft would never allow his daughter to marry someone he didn't approve of, someone he couldn't control. And the beautiful irony, David said with a ghost of a smile, was that my father had insisted David join Croft Enterprises, had personally mentored him, had handed him the keys to the kingdom because he believed David's carefully constructed persona, and had never suspected that the talented young architect was actually the ghost of Robert Vance's son come back to haunt him. But here's what David hadn't planned for, what he hadn't anticipated in his careful blueprint of revenge. He'd underestimated how long 20 years actually is, how difficult it is to maintain perfect hatred across 2 decades of daily life, how hard it is to look at your children and remember they're supposed to be weapons instead of people you die to protect. He said there were moments, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, where he'd forgotten he was playing a role, where Eleanor Mitchell's husband felt more real than David Vance's revenge plot, where he'd catch himself being genuinely happy and have to remind himself that this was all temporary, all part of the plan, all building toward the moment when he'd destroy everything and make Thomas Croft feel what his father had felt. And then my father had died, and David had felt relief, had thought, finally I can execute the final phase. Finally I can tear it all down and fulfill the promise I made at my father's grave. But my father's death had also removed the target, had made the revenge feel hollow because Thomas Croft would never know what David had done, would never feel the pain of losing his empire and his daughter's love simultaneously. The revenge had become about me instead of my father, about hurting a woman who'd never done anything except love him, and David said that's when he knew he'd become something worse than Thomas Croft had ever been, because my father had destroyed Robert Vance's company, but he'd done it for profit and power, for rational if ruthless reasons, whereas David was about to destroy his own wife and children for the satisfaction of a dead man's revenge. I sat there listening to this confession, this explanation that was supposed to make me understand but actually made everything worse because it meant David had known, had seen the moral bankruptcy of what he was doing, and had chosen to proceed anyway. I'd asked him if he'd ever loved me, even a little bit, even for a moment, and he was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer, and then he said, I don't know if I'm capable of love or if I killed that part of myself when I decided to become someone else. I don't know if what I felt for you was real or just method acting taken to its logical extreme. And I'm sorry, but I genuinely cannot tell you if any of it was real because I don't know what real feels like anymore. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me, and it was devastating in its incompleteness, in its refusal to give me the clean answer I wanted. I couldn't hate him properly if he'd loved me even a little, couldn't grieve cleanly if it had all been fake, and his uncertainty trapped me in the same limbo he'd been living in for 20 years, unable to reconcile the performance with the reality because maybe there wasn't a difference anymore. I told him about my father's recording, about how Thomas Croft had known who David was for years, had known and had still allowed the marriage, had still brought David into the company, and David's face went white because this was information that changed everything. That meant his entire revenge plot had been anticipated and allowed. That meant my father had been playing a longer game than David had ever imagined. I explained what I'd realized after listening to that recording multiple times, analyzing my father's words and his strategy, the way he taught me to analyze corporate maneuvers. My father had known about David Vance for years, probably from the moment David had changed his name and entered the architecture world, because Thomas Croft didn't leave loose ends, and he would have been monitoring Robert Vance's family to ensure they didn't become problems. When David had appeared at that conference, when he begun courting me, my father had recognized the play immediately and had made a calculation. Let it proceed. Let David Vance marry into the family. Let him get close enough to think he'd won, and then use him as an object lesson, a demonstration of what happens to people who try to destroy the Croft empire. But something had shifted over the years, I told David. Something in my father had changed as he watched David become a husband and father, as he saw the revenge plot stretched across 2 decades, as he recognized something of himself in this young man who'd been willing to sacrifice everything for a principle. My father's final recording wasn't just a warning to me, it was an admission that he created David Vance through his actions, that the hostile takeover of Vance Corporation had been unnecessary and cruel, motivated more by ego than business necessity, and that David's existence was the price of that cruelty, a living reminder of the human cost of my father's empire building. The Croft legacy protocol, the offshore accounts, the codes hidden in my mother's music box, all of it was my father's way of giving me the power to end the cycle, to choose a different path than he had chosen. He'd known David would eventually make his move, had predicted the boardroom confrontation down to the timing, and he'd left me the tools to turn that confrontation into something other than mutual destruction. My father's final gift wasn't the money or the company, or even the evidence against David. It was the choice, the agency to decide how the story would end, and he trusted that I'd choose better than he had, that I'd find a way to break the cycle of revenge that had consumed both him and David. David sat there processing this information, and I watched him understand that his entire adult life had been not just anticipated but orchestrated, that he'd been playing a role in someone else's game, that Thomas Croft had manipulated him as surely as he'd manipulated everyone else, and the realization broke something in him that the boardroom confrontation hadn't touched. He asked me why I was telling him this, what I hoped to accomplish, and I said because you deserve to know that you weren't as clever as you thought, that my father saw you coming from miles away and chose to let you proceed for his own reasons, and because I needed you to understand that the man you've spent 23 years hating was more complicated than the monster you'd created in your head. I told him that I'd read the articles about the Vance Corporation takeover, had done my own research beyond my father's sanitized version, and I'd learned that Robert Vance hadn't been an innocent victim, but a competitor who'd been engaging in some questionable practices of his own, that the hostile takeover had been brutal but not unprovoked, that the business world my father operated in was an ecosystem of sharks where everyone was predator and prey depending on the circumstances. It didn't excuse what my father had done, didn't make Robert Vance's death any less tragic, but it complicated the narrative David had been living in, added shades of gray to what he'd needed to be black and white in order to sustain 23 years of perfect hatred. David looked at me with something that might have been gratitude or might have been despair, and he said, "You're trying to give me an out, trying to make me feel less guilty about what I've done by complicating my justification for doing it, but it doesn't work that way. Eleanor, I still married you under false pretenses. I still planned to destroy your life. I still betrayed you in ways that can't be undone by historical context or moral complexity." And I said, "I know. I'm not trying to absolve you or make you feel better. I'm trying to help both of us understand how we got here, so maybe we can figure out how to move forward without destroying our children in the process." Our children, I reminded him, who were innocent in all of this, who deserved better than to have their family implode in a spectacular public scandal because their grandfather and father had been locked in a multi-decade revenge cycle. I told David that I'd already decided to tell Alex and Sophie a version of the truth, not the full truth, because they didn't need that burden, but enough truth that they could make informed decisions about their relationship with him. I'd tell them that their father had married me partly for business reasons, that their grandfather had been involved in something that hurt their father's family before they were born, and that all of us were trying to figure out how to move forward from that history. It wasn't the whole story, but it was enough story, enough truth to make sense of the divorce without destroying their ability to have a relationship with their father if they chose to. David asked what I wanted from him going forward, what role I expected him to play in our children's lives, and I said that was up to him, that I wouldn't prevent him from seeing them, but I also wouldn't force a relationship if he couldn't handle it. I told him that the David Mitchell they knew, the engaged father who coached soccer and helped with homework, that person was real enough even if the origin story was fake, and if he wanted to continue being that person for them, I would support it. But if he needed to disappear completely to process what he'd done and who he'd become, I'd help him construct a narrative that wouldn't destroy the children's sense of security, something about needing to find himself or dealing with personal issues, the kind of vague explanation that gives people permission to stop asking questions. He cried then, the first real emotion I'd seen from him in that hotel room, and he said he didn't deserve my kindness, didn't deserve the opportunity to still be a father after what he'd planned to do. And I said, this isn't kindness, David, this is pragmatism. Our children exist and they need at least one parent who's fully present. And since I plan to be that parent, I need you to either step up or step aside cleanly. But I won't let you hover in some liminal space where you're neither present nor absent, where the kids spend their lives waiting for a father who can't decide if he wants to be their father or their grandfather's victim. David chose to step aside, not completely, but mostly, moving across the country to Seattle, where he took a position at a small architecture firm, establishing a new life that was genuinely his own for the first time since he was 17. He calls the children once a week, visits twice a year, sends thoughtful birthday and Christmas gifts, and maintains the kind of pleasant, slightly distant relationship that many divorced fathers have with their college-age children. Alex and Sophie know something happened, something big that their parents aren't telling them, but they're old enough and wise enough not to push for details they sense might hurt more than help. They've accepted the situation with the adaptability of young adults who've learned that family is complicated and sometimes the people you love make choices you can't understand. The Croft Redemption Foundation became my life's work, the thing I wake up for every morning, the legacy I'm building to replace the one my father left me. We've provided restitution to 47 families affected by Croft Enterprises' aggressive business practices. We've funded small business grants and educational scholarships. We've partnered with organizations that help communities recover from corporate exploitation. And every check I sign feels like another step away from my father's shadow and towards something that's genuinely mine. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm using money my father earned through ruthless business practices to undo some of the damage those practices caused, that I'm essentially laundering his legacy through charitable giving, but I've made peace with that irony because the outcome is real help for real people, and intention matters less than impact when you're trying to change systems. The Vance family restitution was particularly meaningful, though also complicated in ways I hadn't anticipated. David's mother was still alive, still in the psychiatric facility where she'd been for 2 decades, and the foundation's check paid for her care for the rest of her life, and then established a trust for any other Vance family descendants. I visited her once, this woman who would have been my mother-in-law if the marriage had been real, and I sat in the common room of her facility while she looked at me with vague recognition and talked about her son Robert, who was going to visit any day now, who was just working late at the office, who was such a good boy, always thinking of others. She'd lost the thread of reality somewhere in the grief, had retreated to a time before the takeover, before the heart attack, before everything fell apart, and I envied her that escape even as I mourned what she'd lost. I didn't tell her who I was, didn't explain about David or the foundation or any of it, just listened to her talk about her husband and her son, the life she'd had before Thomas Croft entered it, and when I left I understood something I hadn't before about the true cost of my father's empire. It wasn't just the money or the companies or the business deals, it was the people, the human beings whose lives were collateral damage in his pursuit of success, and however many checks I wrote, however much money I redistributed, I could never actually undo that damage, never restore what had been taken from families like the Vances. All I could do was acknowledge it, try to make amends, and commit to building something different going forward. Marcus Chun has become not just my lawyer but my friend and advisor, the person I call when I'm struggling with a foundation decision or just need someone who understands the full context of my situation. He told me once, over coffee in his office after a particularly difficult board meeting, that my father would be proud of what I've done with the foundation, that Thomas Croft's dying wish had been for me to be stronger and smarter than he was, to learn from his mistakes without being destroyed by them, and that I'd exceeded even his considerable expectations. I appreciated Marcus saying it, but I'm not sure I believe it. Not sure my father was capable of the kind of pride that isn't mixed with possessiveness and control, but it doesn't matter anymore what my father would have thought because he's gone and I'm here, and this is my life to build or destroy as I see fit. I'm 43 now, a year past the boardroom confrontation, and I'm still processing everything that happened, still unpacking the layers of deception and counter-deception that define my marriage and my father's final years. I've been in therapy twice a week, working through the trauma of realizing your entire adult life was built on someone else's revenge plot, learning to trust my own judgment again, figuring out who Eleanor Croft is when she's not defined by being Thomas Croft's daughter or David Mitchell's wife. It's slow work, this rebuilding of self, slower than I expected, but I'm starting to see glimpses of someone I might actually like, someone who's strong without being cruel, someone who can acknowledge complexity without losing moral clarity. I've started dating again, cautiously, very cautiously, and I've learned to ask questions I never thought to ask David, to look for inconsistencies, to verify stories, to trust my instincts when something feels off instead of explaining it away as paranoia or insecurity. There's a man named Robert, which is ironic given everything, who runs a nonprofit that partners with the Foundation on Economic Development projects, and we've been seeing each other for 3 months, taking it slowly, building something that feels genuine in its ordinariness. He knows my whole story, knows about David and my father and the boardroom confrontation, and he's chosen to be here anyway, which feels like a kind of miracle after 20 years of being chosen for strategic reasons. Robert asked me once, after I told him everything, whether I regretted marrying David, whether I wished I could go back and avoid that first meeting at the architecture conference, and I surprised myself by saying no. Because as destructive and painful as those 20 years were, they also gave me Alex and Sophie, 2 people I love more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and they taught me things about myself I needed to learn, about my capacity for resilience, about the difference between strength and stubbornness, about how you can survive having your entire reality revealed as a lie and still find reasons to get up in the morning. The marriage was built on fraud, but the person I became while living through it and emerging from it, that person is real, and I wouldn't be here without having survived David's deception and my father's manipulations. The house where David and I raised our children, the sprawling suburban monument to our fake perfect life, I sold it 6 months after the divorce was finalized. I couldn't live there anymore, couldn't walk through rooms where every memory was now contaminated by the knowledge of David's true intentions, couldn't sleep in the bed where he'd lain beside me for 20 years planning my destruction. I bought a smaller place downtown, a modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the kind of space that's all clean lines and uncluttered surfaces, the opposite of the house full of accumulated family history and hidden secrets. It feels like starting over, like the physical manifestation of the life I'm building post-David, post-father, post-everything I thought I knew. Alex came to visit me in the new apartment last month, and we sat on the balcony watching the city lights come on as the sun set, and he said, "Mom, I know there's more to the story than you've told us. I know something happened between you and Dad that was bigger than irreconcilable differences, and I just want you to know that I don't need to know what it was. I trust that you're protecting us from something we don't need to carry." And I cried, because at 21 my son had more emotional wisdom than I'd had at 41, and I told him that yes, there was more to the story, and someday if he really needed to know I'd tell him, but for now he was right. Some burdens don't need to be shared across generations. Some secrets are better buried than excavated. Sophie has been harder to reach, angrier about the divorce in ways she can't quite articulate, and I understand it's because she was Daddy's girl, the one who had the special bond with David, and she feels betrayed even though she doesn't know the full extent of his betrayal. She's studying psychology at Northwestern, which feels both ironic and appropriate, and I wonder sometimes if she's subconsciously trying to understand what happened to her family by studying human behavior and motivation. I've given her space, let her be angry, let her process in her own way and her own time, and slowly, incrementally, she's coming back to me, calling more often, visiting during breaks, asking my advice on things she used to ask David about. It's a rebuilding, a slow reconstruction of trust, and I'm patient with it because I know what it's like to have your understanding of someone fundamentally altered and need time to grieve who you thought they were. The foundation hosted its first annual gala last spring, a black tie event that raised $2 million for small business development grants, and standing at the podium giving my speech about economic justice and corporate accountability, I felt my father's presence in a way I hadn't since he died. Not his ghost or his approval, but his influence, the way he trained me to command a room, to speak with authority, to make people believe in a vision even when they weren't sure about the details. I'd taken the skills he taught me for building an empire and repurposed them for dismantling the systems that create empires at other people's expense. And there was a poetry to that, a kind of redemption that felt more real than anything I could have planned. David sent flowers to the gala, an anonymous arrangement that I recognized as from him because the card quoted something he'd said to me on our first date, something about building things that last, and I didn't know whether to be touched or disturbed by the gesture. I chose to be neither, chose to see it as his way of acknowledging what we'd been and what we'd become, a farewell to the marriage that never really was and a recognition of the foundation that rose from its ashes. I didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the flowers beyond having them distributed to patients at the local hospital, because David and I had said everything we needed to say in that hotel room, and anything more would just be reopening wounds that needed to scar. Marcus tells me that David is doing well in Seattle, that he's built a reputation as a talented architect who specializes in affordable housing projects, which feels like his own version of redemption, his own way of using the skills that were supposed to destroy my father's legacy to instead build something that helps people. Marcus says David asks about me sometimes, asks about the kids, asks about the foundation, and Marcus gives him minimal information because that's what I've asked for, but Marcus thinks maybe someday, years from now, David and I might be able to have a different kind of relationship, something that acknowledges what we were and what we did to each other without being defined by it. I'm not sure I believe that's possible, not sure you can ever really be friends with someone who married you as an act of revenge, but I'm also learning that forgiveness and reconciliation are different things, and maybe I've already forgiven David for being broken in the same ways my father was broken, even if I can never reconcile with him. The thing nobody tells you about revenge, about being on either the giving or receiving end of it, is how empty it feels when it's over, how the satisfaction you thought you'd feel is actually just exhaustion mixed with regret. David spent 23 years pursuing revenge against my father and ended up destroying himself in the process, becoming the kind of man who could look at his own children and see them as collateral damage in someone else's war. My father spent his whole life building an empire at other people's expense, and died, knowing his daughter would probably tear it down to build something better. And I spent one moment in a boardroom destroying my husband's revenge plot, and the rest of my life dealing with the aftermath, the complicated grief of mourning a marriage that never existed and a man who was never who I thought he was. But here's what I've learned in the year since that boardroom confrontation, what I tell myself on the hard days when the weight of everything threatens to crush me. Revenge is a fire that consumes the person holding it just as surely as the person it's aimed at, and the only way to survive it is to let it burn out and then carefully, painstakingly, rebuild from the ashes. My father understood that in his final days, understood that his legacy of corporate ruthlessness had created enemies like David Vance, and he tried to give me the tools to end the cycle, to choose a different path. David is starting to understand it in Seattle, building affordable housing instead of burning down empires, learning to be David Vance again instead of the hollow man who played David Mitchell for 20 years. And I'm understanding it here in my apartment with the floor-to-ceiling windows, running a foundation that tries to heal the wounds my father's business practices created, dating a man who chose me for reasons that have nothing to do with revenge or strategy or legacy. The Croft name still opens doors, still carries weight in business and philanthropic circles, but it means something different now, stands for something other than ruthless corporate efficiency. When people hear Croft Redemption Foundation, they think about families helped, businesses saved, communities rebuilt, and maybe that's the best possible ending for my father's legacy. Not preservation but transformation. Not defending what he built but using the resources he accumulated to undo some of the damage he caused. It's not perfect, not even close to perfect, but it's something. It's a choice to break the cycle instead of perpetuating it, and some days that feels like enough. I'm writing this all down now, this whole complicated story of revenge and counter-revenge and attempted redemption, because my therapist says it's important to process trauma through narrative, to take the chaotic experience and shape it into something with beginning and middle and end, even if real life doesn't actually work that way. She says I need to tell my story so I can move past it, so it becomes something that happened to me rather than something I'm still living through. And I think she's right. I think there's power in putting words to experience, in claiming ownership of your own narrative instead of letting others define you through their versions of events. But I'm also writing this as a warning, a cautionary tale about the cost of revenge and the weight of legacy and the danger of building your identity around someone else's sins. David Vance built his entire adult life around avenging his father, and in doing so he lost 23 years and destroyed a marriage and became someone even he didn't recognize. My father built an empire on ruthless business practices and created enemies who would spend decades trying to destroy him. And I almost fell into the same trap, almost let my response to David's betrayal define the rest of my life, before I realized that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation, taking what was meant to harm you and alchemizing it into something that helps others. So this is my story, the story of Eleanor Croft, who discovered her husband married her to destroy her father, who found out her father knew all along and left her the tools to end the cycle, who stood in a boardroom and turned revenge into redemption, who survived the collapse of her entire understanding of her own life and chose to build something better from the wreckage. It's not a happy ending, not exactly, because there are too many casualties, too much pain that can't be undone, too many years lost to deception and counter-deception. But it's an ending I can live with, an ending that leaves room for new beginnings, for relationships built on honesty, for a legacy that heals instead of harms. Alex graduates this spring, Sophie the following year, and they'll go out into the world carrying pieces of both their parents, the good and the bad, the real and the performed, and I hope they've learned from watching us destroy each other that some patterns need to be broken, some legacies need to be transformed, some revenges need to be abandoned before they consume everything you are. I hope they choose better than David chose, better than my father chose, better than I might have chosen if my father hadn't left me that recording and those codes, and that one final gift of agency. Robert asked me last week if I'd ever want to get married again, and I surprised both of us by saying maybe someday, if I can ever trust that someone loves me for me and not for what I represent or what they can gain from me. He said that's fair, that's reasonable, that he'd wait as long as it takes because he's chosen me for all the right reasons and he's patient and he's not going anywhere. And I almost believed him, almost let myself hope that there's a version of my life where I get to be loved genuinely and fully and without ulterior motive, where I get to be Eleanor, not Croft, not Mitchell, not victim, or Victor, but just myself, whoever that turns out to be. The foundation board meets tomorrow, and we're voting on a major new initiative to provide legal support for families fighting corporate exploitation, a program that would have been unthinkable during my father's lifetime but feels urgently necessary now. I've prepared my presentation, marshaled my arguments, anticipated objections, using all the skills my father taught me but directing them toward opposite ends, and I think we'll win the vote. I think we'll launch the program. I think we'll help people who need it desperately. And if that's not justice, if that's not redemption, if that's not the best possible outcome of this whole complicated mess, then I don't know what is. I still think about David sometimes, wonder what his life looks like in Seattle, wonder if he's happy or at least content, wonder if he ever thinks about me with anything other than regret or shame. I wonder if he's forgiven himself for what he tried to do, or if he's still carrying that weight, still defining himself by his father's tragedy and his own attempted revenge. I wonder if he's learned what I'm learning, that you can't build a life on someone else's pain, that inherited trauma has to be processed and released or it will poison everything you touch, that the only way forward is through forgiveness, not of others necessarily but of yourself, for being human and fallible and shaped by forces you didn't choose. Marcus Chun says I'm one of the strongest people he's ever known, says my father would be proud, says I've turned a situation that could have destroyed me into something that defines me in the best possible way. I'm not sure about any of that. Not sure strength is the right word for survival. Not sure pride matters from a dead man. Not sure anything defines me except the choices I make going forward. But I appreciate Marcus saying it, appreciate having someone in my life who knew me before and knows me after and sees the through line, the continuity that proves I'm still me despite everything. The city lights are coming on outside my windows, the same lights that come on every evening, the same rhythm and pattern that exists regardless of human drama, regardless of revenge plots and boardroom confrontations and marriages built on lies. There's something comforting about that constancy, something grounding about the fact that the world keeps turning even when your personal world is falling apart, that life continues in its mundane dailiness even in the middle of extraordinary circumstances. I pour myself a glass of wine, stand at the window watching the city breathe, and I think about beginnings and endings and the messy space in between where most of life actually happens. This is where my story ends, at least this chapter of it, standing at a window in a city that knew my father and knows me and will know my children, watching lights come on in thousands of windows where thousands of people are living their own complicated stories of love and betrayal and attempted redemption. I don't know what the next chapter looks like, don't know if it includes Robert or another marriage, or just me and the foundation, and my children building lives that break the patterns that almost destroyed us. But I know it will be honest, know it will be mine, know it will be chosen rather than inherited or imposed or constructed as part of someone else's revenge plot. And maybe that's the real victory, the real revenge if you want to call it that. Not the boardroom moment or the foundation or the transformation of my father's legacy, but simply this. I'm still here, still standing, still choosing, still building a life that's authentically mine despite everything that tried to define me as something else. David Vance tried to destroy Thomas Croft's daughter and ended up destroying himself. Thomas Croft tried to build an empire that would outlast him and ended up creating the conditions for its own transformation. And I, Eleanor Croft, survived them both, learned from them both, and chose something different than either of them would have chosen, something that looks less like winning and more like healing, less like revenge and more like redemption. The wine is good, the view is beautiful, the foundation is thriving, my children are growing into remarkable adults despite their parents' failures, and Robert is texting to confirm dinner plans for tomorrow. This is my life now, complicated and imperfect and entirely mine, built not on the foundation of my father's empire or my husband's deception, but on the choices I've made in the aftermath of both. It's not the life I thought I'd have, not the fairy tale I believed in on my wedding day, but it's real and honest and full of possibility, and after 20 years of living in a lie, reality feels like the greatest luxury imaginable. If this story left you speechless, smash that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, was justice served, or did I go too far? And don't forget to subscribe, you won't want to miss next week's chilling confession.